But what I do remember is him beating her, not only in rage, but with cold, methodical planning. Not only with his hands and his feet, but with words and weapons too. And pregnancies didn't stop him. Like all of us, she lived in a constant state of terror. Now, I probably don't even know half of the brutality that my father inflicted on my mother, but I can assure you that I heard and I saw plenty. As a child, I was beaten, I was tied up, I was locked in closets, I was hammered, I was burned, just to name a few of the things my father did. Now, this was not about a man who had a hard time controlling his temper, you see, because my dad took great care not to hit us on the face or parts of our body that were not covered up by clothing. So, people ask me, what were the triggers that set your father off? Well, I'm not really sure. To my knowledge, my father didn't have a dependency to drugs or alcohol, and we were never really sure what my father's rules were or what might be the cause behind the physical, emotional, or spiritual abuse that he inflicted on us. Because you see, the rules could change from moment to moment. If my dad told us a joke and our laughter wasn't to his liking, that could set him off. And when there are no rules, everyone copes in their own way. Some become paralyzed in fear, others go into denial and disassociation, and others become confrontational and full of rage. I was the latter case, putting myself in the path of my father's storm, if only to distract him from beating other members of my family. Now, I mention this to you not because I was trying to be a hero, but to shed some light on the devastating impact that witnessing violence has on children. In many ways, as a child who was being battered by his father with the intensity of someone hitting another adult, well, I learned to take it. But it was much harder for me to witness the violence being done against other family members, and including our pets, than it was for me to receive it myself. Now, that survivors tell me over the years that, because they weren't physically beaten, that the psychological and emotional abuse that they suffered must not be as damaging as someone who is physically harmed. But what I've learned is that the body can heal quite miraculously. Mine has. On the other hand, the battering of the psyche and soul, that takes so much longer to repair. Of all the physically deviant ways that my father thought of to cause me pain, the one thing he did that hurt me more than anything happened one day when he didn't even lift a finger to me. He'd been putting me down, calling me stupid and worthless and a lot of other damaging names that I cannot repeat. And I finally had it with my father, and I challenged him, and I said, hey, if I'm so worthless, what are all those trophies doing up there? And I pointed to a shelf covered in trophies that I'd won in baseball. Well, my father told me that those trophies meant nothing to him. And then to prove it, he pulled them all down, he got out a sledgehammer, and he broke each and every one of those trophies in front of me. He just smashed them until they were unrecognizable. And that is what happened to my self-esteem. Now, the other question that we hear all the time is, why doesn't a woman just leave? Why didn't my mom get herself and her kids the hell out of there? Well, I'll tell you why. Because, you see, my mother didn't speak English. And she came from a country and a culture where women stayed with their men no matter what. And you have to remember this was over 35 years ago, where there was very, very little public awareness about domestic violence, family violence, or any programs, shelters, hotlines, legislation, or community services that might have helped us, if only there was. By the way, my encounter at the police station, that was not the first or the only time that my family dealt with the authorities. We were left with the impression that the only way that they would make an arrest was if he killed one of us, or we killed him. And believe me, I came real close to doing that. That's how desperate we had become. But thankfully, in my day and in those neighborhoods, guns were much harder to come by. Now, in fact, in the field, experts in the field of crime prevention have observed that currently a significant percentage of boys between the ages of 12 and 18 who are incarcerated for murder are there because they killed their mom's abuser. Now, there's another reason that may explain why my mother never left, which has to do with the reality that when a woman leaves, she and her children are often in the gravest danger of being killed by their abuser, even when they're holding that restraining order. Now, there's never been any debate among those who deal with this issue about the connection between economic stress and family violence. We only have to read the news to see that it's real. For example, here in Ohio, a recent report from social service advocates is showing as much as a 16% increase in cases of child abuse and neglect that can be connected to job loss and increasing poverty. I was in Tacoma, Washington 2 weeks ago, and I saw a community coping with economic crisis and reeling from 7 domestic violence murders in less than 2 months. And 5 of those killed were children. They were murdered by the former husband, their father. He did this to punish his wife for leaving him. All of this is why we have to do more to connect the dots of violence that will otherwise spiral out of control, and why coordination between agencies and individuals is so necessary for developing safety plans in different communities and is so desperately important for saving and rebuilding lives. But the main reason why my mom never left was because she feared for our lives. So instead of my mother leaving my father, he abandoned her while she was pregnant and then kidnapped my two brothers, my sister, and me, taking us from Los Angeles, California, all the way to Miami, Florida, on a torturous cross-country trip that should have killed us but didn't before we made it to Miami. Of all the indignities that my mother had to endure at the hands of my father, having her children taken from her is still one of the scars that haunts her to this day. Now, it took my mom many months to figure out where we were, have my baby sister Carmen, and then to move to Florida herself. And when she arrived in Miami, she was granted a divorce. But because my father earned more money at the time, he retained custody of all the children living with him. So without my mother in the household, things went from worse to horrendous. At 15, even though I was absolutely terrified of my father, I knew I couldn't live with his madness any longer. And that eventually led to the first and only physical confrontation with my father that I started. I exposed him for the coward that he was. He was a man that for all those years had wielded absolute power over his defenseless wife and small children. And he was cowering and crying beneath me. And all I ever wanted from my father was for him to love me. But in that instant, I knew the truth that I think many victims of family violence finally realize, and that is that love should never hurt. No matter how bitterly a man cries as he beats a woman and says, "I'm only doing it because I love you so much," or that he's brutally punishing his children to make them better because he loves them so much. That's not love. And this is not love. So that night, I ran away from home and from my father's terror for good. And after several days of living on the streets, a high school classmate of mine spotted me and told me everyone was looking for me, the school, the cops, my father. Well, I told him what had been happening to me at home, and he insisted that I go home and tell my story to his father. Now, in my life, I've had many angels that have helped to guide me out of my darkness. My friend's father was one of these angels, and he also happened to be a lawyer. So through his help, I was able to take my father to the court where I was granted a restraining order. And you got to remember the year was 1971. It was practically unheard of for a child to take a parent to court, but I'll never forget walking into that judge's chambers and seeing that the judge was a woman with pictures of her children on her desk, and I knew I was going to be safe. That was one of the last times I saw my father, who died when I was in my 20s. Now, I'm also grateful that there were other angels in my community. You know, we've all heard that expression, it takes the village to raise a child. And, you know, if you think it's quaint or overused, well, I'm standing here to say that I was that child who was rescued and raised by his village. For the last 2.5 years of high school, I was taken in like the unofficial foster child by several families within my school. You want to talk about that village and about diversity? Okay, there was the Jewish family that owned a Chinese restaurant. The Italian family with 9 kids, I made 10, 2 Cuban families, and a Southern Baptist family. For all the years that I've been given the message that I was unworthy and deserving of being heard, I was now being given a different message by people who cared, my coaches, my teachers, my friends. And that message was that I was a good human being, worthy of being loved and of loving in return. Now, I'd be lying to you if I told you this new road I was on didn't have a lot of bumps along the way. Shortly after leaving my father's home, I joined a street gang. I remember not even flinching or crying during the ritual beating that I took when I got jumped into the gang. Fortunately, back then, we fought with our hands and not with guns. The idea of joining a gang for me was my desperate search for belonging, as it is for a lot of kids today, for the feeling of approval and love that's sometimes still lacking at home. Fortunately for me, I was beginning to find that somewhere else. In my senior year of high school, I moved in with the last family, a Cuban family, the Echevarrias, who basically adopted me as a member of their family, which I'm proud to say I'm still a member of today. And my adopted mother, Lillian, told me many years later that she had been warned by a lot of members of the community about taking me in, because I suppose to them, at 6'2" and over 200 pounds, a former gang member, I was a big, tough, scary kid from a bad background. But she said that taking me in was something that her family had to do to try to make a difference in my life. They believed in me, and I've done my best not to let them or my other angels down. So as a result of all of these positive forces around me, I was able to turn my life turn it around dramatically. In a short time, I went from being a violent member of a street gang in my sophomore year to president of my senior class. I led it in 4 sports. I was captain of the football team. I went on to receive a 4-year football scholarship to Florida State University, where I made the dean's list and was the team captain. At Florida State, I was lucky enough to play for Coach Bobby Bowden, who was another angel and a father figure to me, as he has been to many a player. And after graduating from Florida State with a degree in criminology, why I'm an actor, I became a free agent draft pick and the first Cuban American to be given a tryout with the Miami Dolphins, which I should clarify, this didn't put me on the active team roster, but it allowed me to play in 2 preseasons with the team that I idolized, my hometown team,